Welcome to the talk, and thanks for inviting me, despite the initial mess up. So a quick introduction. I'm Darren, and Ceri's sort of sat just there. So we've been doing dung beetles for a while. I've been doing it since I was very little and never really grew out of it. And I kind of converted Ceri to the filthy ways of the dung beetle person about 4 or 5 years ago. And so yeah, so we've been doing dung beetles quite a while now. So as some of you may know, dung beetles have been worshipped, and quite rightly so. I mean, I think they still should be. Unfortunately, they're not. But they've been around for a long time. People have known about them for a long time, but we haven't really understood much about them. It's kind of, there's this mythology around them, hence the worship. If all dung beetles look like this, I'm sure we would worship them, but sadly they don't all look like that. And in the UK, we kind of have, some people say dull and boring. I don't think so. I mean, this one here has even got a bit of shiny on it. It's a bit coloured there. You can see it's quite nice and metallic. So what we have are 3 main groups in the UK. We've got gear troopids, the door beetles. These are the big things that most people have seen, sort of like bumbling around. They come to light traps. The smaller, sort of like the true dung beetles, I mean, they're called that because this is the main group outside of sort of north temperate regions that does all the dung removal. In north temperate regions, though, we tend to have more of these sort of smaller aphrodines, which are often referred to as lesser dung beetles, which I think is a bit derogatory in my view, but you know, we've got to think of better names for these things. So you've all heard of dung beetles rolling dung, and that seems to be everybody believes that all dung beetles roll dung. Sadly, that's not the case. And in fact, in the UK, we don't actually have any of the rollers. Occasionally, you might see one of our minotaur beetles pushing dung along, but not generally making a ball and rolling away. With Tophaeus, the minotaur beetle, they're actually just grabbing a bit of sheep pellet or rabbit poo or something like that that's already formed into a ball and just rolling that along. So we've got the rollers, and they basically grab a pile of dung and roll it away from the dung, stick it in the ground to avoid competition with the others. Then the tunnelers, which come into the dung and actually just drag dung down into a tunnel and create a nest, and either sort of like create little sausage-shaped brood balls or actual balls in the right sense. And then they basically lay their eggs in there, and the larvae develop and emerge the following year. And then we've got what we've got, which are mostly dwellers. So most of our species, the little aphrodines, actually live inside the dung and complete most of their life cycle actually inside the dung. And they may come out to pupate, and some of them do actually tunnel as well, but most of them will actually be in the larval stage in the actual dung itself. And those are the dwellers. But we've also got the different ways of using dung and different times of using dung. So we've got nocturnal, diurnal, we've got species that prefer sandy soils, those that like clay soils, some like older dung than other species. So you've got this whole sort of little ecosystem going on inside a pile of poo. And we're not only discussing the beetles. I mean, we've got within that, we've got the dung, which is that lump of poo. Then we've got the dung beetles coming in. We're actually there to feed on the dung itself, although it's probably that they're feeding on the microbial soup that's associated with the dung from the stomach of the animal. Then we've got the dung feeding flies. Then we've got the flies that eat the flies. Then we've got the beetles that eat the flies, the beetles that eat the beetles. Then at the end of the session, we start to see all these sort of fungivorous things coming in. So as the dung goes mouldy, you'll get these sort of things that like fungi coming in to eat the fungi that's in the dung. And then you'll get the parasites and the parasitoids coming in that actually predate on the other things that are in there. So there's this whole little ecosystem going on in there. But it all starts with a pile of poo. If you think about how many animals are actually out there, I mean, in the UK alone, we've got about 10 million cows, which is quite a lot of dung produced per annum. And that also includes, you know, sort of like the dairy and the beef, but excludes things like all of these little sheepy, horsey, pigs, deer, and that's my dog. I mentioned to somebody earlier that you'd see my dog in the slide later on. So that's Pippi. So it's not only cows that produce dung, so there's a lot of dung out there. And unfortunately, if this dung is just left to its own devices without dung beetles or other animals and plants and fungi getting involved, it just sits around on the soil, which is no use nor ornament. So one of the benefits of dung beetles is that we have a multitude of ecosystem functions and services, which is kind of a way of justifying their existence. So you can kind of say, well, we've got to save bees because bees produce honey, therefore they have some value. We don't, you know, just say we should save bees because bees are worth saving. We've got to give them some economic value. And the same's been applied to dung beetles, where we've obviously got the dung removal, nutrient cycling, plant growth, and so on and so forth. So they've got all these sort of, they don't do it for us, they're just doing it. And this is sort of like what happens through their, you know, normal biological practices. So if we get on to dung removal, more beetles you have, the more poo gets taken away. I mean, it's kind of common sense, really. But it doesn't kind of work in a very sort of like, you know, one dung beetle removes 1 gram, 2 beetles removes 2 grams. You actually find that there's this sort of competition and facilitation between the different species within the dung. And what you end up with is, if you've got, as in this figure here, you've got no dung beetles, so not so much dung removed. Then you've got the no geared troupies, that's the big ones, these guys up here, but you've got aphodius, which is the little one there, and you get dung removal. Then you've got geared troupies and no aphodius, and that's how much dung's removed. But when you put them both together, so you've got the full complement of species, you're actually getting more dung removed than the sort of like the sum of the other 2 species. So there's obviously something going on there between the different species, and it's likely a competition thing, but we just don't know. Then if we go on to, soil health. So on this we've got, it's got it again, infiltration. So if we've got different soil types and organic matter sat on it, it's basically just going to sit on top. You'll get some infiltration through wind, rain, weathering. But actually where you get the dung beetles burying the dung and actually making holes, as you can see there, and there and there, we're actually getting that organic matter back into the soil and locking it away, which also attracts more worms, because if there's dung in the soil and not just on the soil, it brings in more worms. So they're actually very good for the whole soil health. So again, here we've got functionality assemblages are required to provide multiple ecosystem functions. So basically what we're saying here is the more species you have, the more of those, you know, the sort of roller, tunneler, dweller, all those different groups facilitate each other. And the more you have, the more sort of intact that system is, the more ecosystem functioning happens. So they're very useful for this sort of like the overall soil health. And one of the things that people forget about is that dung beetles also are sort of like, basically they're sort of like a passenger bus for other things. So when they fly from dung to dung to dung, not only do they carry along sort of bits of fungal spores and bacteria and things from the last bit of dung they were in, but also they've got this little army of parasites and predators that are associated with them. And in Australia, this is a specimen of Darwin's, he actually noticed that this dung beetle, this is Onthophagus australis, I think it's called, was actually eating cattle dung, which is unusual because in Australia cows aren't native. We took them there, but this dung beetle was managing to eat that. But most of the dung beetles in Australia don't actually eat cow poo. So unfortunately for the Australians, that meant that there was about 480,000 million flies hatching every day, which if you get annoyed with a few flies flying around your picnic in summer here, you can imagine what it was like in Australia. So it got really, really bad to the point where they had to do something about it. So unlike most biological controls where we introduce something silly and make a mess of it, with the dung beetles, we actually introduced them to eat the cattle dung, so biocontrol of cattle dung. But because the native fauna wasn't interested in cow poo, they actually didn't compete with each other. So this was actually, quite a good response in terms of biocontrol, and probably one of the most successful. And what they actually found was there's a significant reduction in both irritant flies, so hematobia and things like this, so the pestiferous flies, if you like, but also it increased soil health and everything else. And even in the UK, we've got these little mites. So you can see here, this is the underside of a door beetle, and hopefully you can make out all the tiny little mites. This is one of the reasons they're often called lousy watchmen, because they're covered in mites. So I think this is Parasites, the genus, these two here. You see it's got this little line across the middle. So I think that's Parasites. So these mites, all they do is they jump on the dung beetle, they get a lift to the next pile of dung, they jump off and they eat the fly eggs and larvae, and then they jump on the next dung beetle and go to the next pile of poo. So it's basically Uber for mites, I think dung beetles are. We also have that if there's dung on the fields and it's got the larval stages of the parasites that infect animals, if that dung is left in situ, those larvae can move on to their next host, their secondary host, and complete that life cycle. So what we've found with dung beetles in numerous examples, and I can provide references if people are really interested in this sort of stuff, is that by having dung beetles involved, you actually get a reduction in the amount of parasites in livestock. So by having this sort of natural system of breaking down the dung and making it uninhabitable or not optimal for these parasites to complete their life cycle, we're actually reducing the parasite load of the livestock, which is of benefit to farmers. And even reducing sort of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's been some work done where basically they stick a bucket over a pile of poo and suck the gases out and see what happens. And then they add dung beetles or don't have dung beetles. And they found that, you know, dung beetles have a positive impact on the emissions of greenhouse gases. However, in another research paper, they say it increases greenhouse gases. So it's typical science. It depends on the methodology and everything else that, you know, people will be arguing about this for years to come. But on the general, you know, if the dung's not on the surface and it's in the ground, it's probably better off with dung beetles helping us along. And one of the most recent things that came out was that this dung beetle called Cataseus molossus, which is used in traditional medicine in China, apparently has some anti-cancer effect of some chemical that I can't pronounce the name of to a minor cancer. I saw this and I got very excited about this because this beetle in particular, Cataseus molossus, is one of my favorite dung beetles. However, if you actually look at the picture, that's what they did their work on, and that's Cataseus molossus. They're two completely different species. So it makes me worry about the research if they can't identify their beetle, because this is a thing called Copris otus, I think, probably. But anyway, so that's a bit worrying. If you don't really care about any of that, and you're a vertebrate person, well, they're food for other insectivorous animals. So bats are particularly fond of the nocturnal Aphodius rufipes, which is quite a common and widespread species in the UK. And this is probably one of the most important foods for greater horseshoe bat during the breeding period. So this beetle basically breeds in most pastures. It's found from the south to the far north, and it can be in huge numbers. And I think anybody who's run a light trap will recognise this beetle. And obviously the birds like them as well. So some recent work done up in Scotland has found that there's a similarity, should we say, in the breeding success of choughs and the success of dung beetles. So there's some sort of interaction going on there. So it's about, I imagine it's just about food availability. Basically, if there's lots of dung beetles, there's lots of food. So there's a co-decline almost in chough and dung beetles. So the dung beetles are going downhill because of various reasons, habitat loss and everything else. And the choughs are struggling with that. So it may not be that there's a direct consequence, but it's basically food availability. And all of that. So a few years ago, so this is 2015 now, so going back a few years, Sarah Bainan calculated that all of those things that we've just explained about the ecosystem functioning and services that they provide comes to about 367 million per year. I imagine it's slightly more than that because obviously it's going to be a slight bit of inflation, and with Brexit and everything else, it's going to be slightly more, I would think. So dung beetles actually have an economic value, as well as just being very nice animals. And in fact, this isn't yet really recognised in the UK. But in New Zealand and Australia, you remember our case earlier where we spoke about the infestation of flies and them having to import dung beetles from abroad to get rid of their poo for them. This is now turned into a big business in parts of North America and in Australia and New Zealand. So there are whole companies out there that basically breed dung beetles to sell to farmers. So coming back to the UK fauna, so I've been playing around with the UK fauna for quite a few years now. And in 2014-15, we were asked to do a review of the conservation status of the UK Scarabaeoidea. So that's dung beetles, chafers and their allies. So not just the coprophagic, the dung feeding things, but the whole group. Because we run the recording scheme. And we started looking at the data, and I came to the realization, A, that the data that we had was bloody awful in terms of its quality and verification, but also there were a lot of species that we hadn't seen recently that we just didn't notice that were disappearing. And after we did this sort of review, so we got all the data we could, this is based on about 40 to 50,000 records. We basically examined those data and looked for declines and threats. And overall, just under about half the UK Scarabaeoidea are actually under some form of threat or another. And very few of them are actually, you could consider doing very well. However, some are doing better than others. So this is a little winter active species called Melanopterus consputus. We're going to probably call it the cheeky beetle because it's got really nice little pink, sort of pinky reddish, orangey cheeks. It's a small beetle. This is a piece of rabbit poo, and that's the fluff where the beetles entered it. So it's quite a little beetle. There are actually more sites in the last 20 years than there has ever been for this beetle. So it was pretty much, if you read the literature from the sort of 80s, it was pretty much restricted to sort of southeast England, Kent, and that was it. And more recently, it's been discovered in Norfolk and all the way across to Gloucestershire over here. This is just about the Gloucestershire-Oxfordshire border. So it seems to be, you know, spreading, but is it really spreading, or is it just that nobody's bothered to look? So this is one of the problems I have with some of the data, because we've basically become obsessed with recording dung beetles in the last 5 years. There's more data now than there ever has been. So we're generating a lot of records, which means that this species seems to be on the increase because we've got it at a lot of new 10kms. But if we'd have recorded there 30, 40, 50 years ago, would there actually have been records all here, here and here where it's disappeared from now? So we can't really assess this very easily because it's certainly nationally scarce. It's restricted to the southeast with some sort of outliers over here, and it's all on limestone or chalk. But because we can't go back in time and see if it's disappeared from all of the interconnecting areas, we can't say for certain if it's an increase or a historical sort of refugia. This one, however, pretty sure this is a winner. So this is a woodland specialist, and if you read the sort of older literature, it kind of says in deer dung in woodlands, which is true. It is in deer dung in woodlands, and there's some evidence there because that's some deer dung in a wood with some beetles in it. And this is a slide that I created just after we did the review, and I was sort of talking about, you know, I believe that this is a genuine increase because there's more deer around now, and people have realised that it's not just deer dung in woodland. It's if you put a piece of dung of any form, apart from, it doesn't like dog or human, but if you put any other dung, herbivore dung in a wood, you will actually find this beetle if there's regular traffic of deer going through. And so I decided last year to put my money where my mouth was. And so August and October of last year, we did a few more, sorry, in 2019, and then a few more last year. We kind of stuck out 120 traps in various sites. So this is a sort of Google Maps thing. So you can see all of these little marks are basically the sites where we're planning to or have trapped. And all we did was I looked on the maps and on Google Earth and things like that, found a woodland that looked suitable for deer to occur in, that had public access or rights of way, and then just shoved a trap next to the wood. And there's the trap just there, well camouflaged to stop people and livestock going into it. And we actually generated 374 records for 18 dung beetle species, and 60% of the traps had Zenkeride. So now when you look at the map, there's a nice before and after. So unfortunately now, and this goes back to something I said earlier, if you considered Aphodia senkeri, you would say that it basically, the hotspot for that species is in the Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire, Warwickshire area. Is complete rubbish. That's basically, I live somewhere there. That's an hour from my house where I stuck a trap. That's all that data shows you. It's kind of, yeah, not really useful until you do something like this, and then you sort of overlay it on the distribution of roe deer, for example. You can actually see that there's basically a strong correlation between roe deer population numbers and this beetle. So I'm not saying that it's only feeding on the roe deer, but I think the abundance and availability of deer dung in woods has actually helped this species do quite well, because we don't stick pesticides on most deer, as far as I know. And so there's always that dung availability without those additions of the pesticides that we keep giving other livestock. So this is one that's from your neck of the woods, up in on the Lancashire coast. Unfortunately, it's never been found on Cheshire, as far as I know. Somebody may be able to prove me wrong if they know of an old record. So this is the sort of Ainsdale dung beetle, because it's only ever been found pretty much in Ainsdale. And this is a species that really struggled. And in the review from 2016, we actually had it down as extinct, because there hadn't been any records for about 30 years, despite people looking on a regular basis. And we were fortunate enough to get sponsorship to actually go and do some survey work. So you can actually see on the map here, the little dots are where we recorded a scarab of some description, because we recorded everything we came across. And the little lines are basically the areas we covered. And we eventually found this beetle. We found, I think, 7 individuals in piles of rabbit poo like this, which was, you know, for us, it was incredible, because, yeah, I did swear quite a lot on that day. And I was quite happy about that. So this is a rabbit poo, and there's the beetle. So it's quite a small thing, and that's quite a big area. But we did spend quite a few days looking. So we found 7 beetles. Based on the report we wrote, we kind of made an assessment saying if there was more dung, the beetle would do better. Last year, during all the lockdown and everything, when the lockdown eased, I luckily managed to drive up for a day, up to the site and do some work where the cattle had been left grazing on site over the summer. Unfortunately, before, they always take the cattle off the site to stop damaging some silly plant or other, which is not good for the dung beetle because there's no dung available. So it's restricted to rabbit. They left the cattle dung on site over the summer, and I was up there for, what, an hour, and I think I counted over 80 beetles, which is probably more than has been caught in the last 100 years of that species. So just leaving cows on the sand dune actually was of great benefit to this species. So that was quite nice. And yeah, it got a bit of publicity, and it was the Tuniptera Trust who got all the glory from it, which is great, because they're doing amazing work up there. So, I mean, in terms of conservation, everything's impacted by habitat loss, degradation and fragmentation. But the sort of coprophagic fauna and flora is also impacted by dung quality and quantity, the loss of grazing and the use of these endectocides. These are the sort of wormers that we keep plying our animals with. So if you think about habitat sort of fragmentation, habitat loss. So this is a Lulworth Cove down the bottom here. I visited many years ago and did some work over this side and recorded 12 species on the nice habitat here. I went back to look at that site and there's no animals, so no beetles, no dung beetles anyway. Luckily, they've got grazing the other side. And we managed to find 14 species. That's obviously where all the poo was, just in that patch. But in between those two nice permanent grasslands, there's this very improved grassland. And we only found 7 species. So just within a small area, just by improving that habitat, going from permanent grassland to sort of like an improved ryegrass, we're actually losing about half the species, even though they're on the same soils, in the same area, and, you know, only a few hundred meters away from each other. We've also got problems with other habitat loss, like fragmentation. So good quality habitat is being reduced, and often it's only managed by conservation organisations and sometimes they don't like to graze the site. So this is a site which most of you will have seen, I would have thought, if you've ever driven down the M5 towards Devon. So this is Crook Peak here. It's a National Trust site, and grazed all year round. It has horses and sheep and cows and all sorts of stuff going on it. And it's absolutely a phenomenal site. So, I mean, it has over a quarter of the scarab species, let alone just the dung beetles. I mean, that's what we've got, 60 dung beetle species. So it's nearly half the population, the species of dung beetles in the UK, just on this one site. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible place. And it also has this one, which is the best, it's the best site in the UK for this one dung beetle, which is quite a rarity, should we say. It was originally on the British list based on some specimens from Matley Bog, which were actually misidentifications. Then Colin Johnson found one from Fairborn in North Wales. And then we found some in museum collections in Oxford and Cardiff. And then Dave Gibbs found one on Crook Peak. And then we basically went and did some survey works and eventually found some really nice specimens in Bristol as well. So that's the Bristol collection just there. So this is a thing that was, you know, pretty much known from one beetle. With a bit of work and effort and examining museum collections, we actually found that it's, well, I wouldn't say it's common, but at least we've got an idea of where it lives now. So this is, there's the motorway coming down, there's the view you just had there. This is basically the site. But when you actually look at the number of individual beetles that we've found, so we only know of 112 beetles, and this is not just, you know, records, this is individual beetles that have been caught for this species, which isn't a lot really. And one of the worrying things is that if you look at the sort of like the habitat matrix around it, so we've got a really nice site, which is here, and you can actually see all the way around it is pretty much horrible arable and sort of like ploughed and either crops or on rotation or improved. So you've only got this sort of really nice patch of habitat here. Luckily, it does go on a bit that way. But when you see where the beetle is, it's kind of almost restricted to the permanent, really good quality grasslands. And all you need to do is remove the animals for 1 year and the beetles sort of disappears, basically. The other problem we have with dung is dung quality. Most of you have seen dung like this. This is what cow dung's meant to look like. So because we feed most of our animals on very improved nitrogen-rich grasslands, basically for beef and dairy yields, we end up with cows with the shits, pretty much, have diarrhea. This is a Highland cow on a sandy site, so a rough grassland. So really nice, good quality dung. We also have a problem with lack of grazing. So this is a sand dune system in North Devon, and the beetles there are actually there's two very rare beetles there. For one of them, I think it's currently the only known site in England for it now. Basically, it was surviving quite well on dog poo at one point, and then people started suffocating the dog poo in bags for some reason. I'm not quite sure why they do that. They're better off just putting it somewhere the beetles can get to it. So here's a minotaur beetle on some dog. There's a nice bit of dog poo there that's been almost eaten out. And at one sand dune system in South Wales, in one piece of dog poo, we actually found sort of over 100 beetles. I mean, there wasn't a lot of dog poo left on that one, I can tell you. And the problem with this sort of lack of grazing is that for some species, so this is quite a rarity, called Euheptalorchus sus. So it was recorded, these are all the sites that it was supposedly found at. And in fact, all the red ones are based on errors of misidentification. The green ones are where we've actually confirmed that it did occur there. And obviously the ones that it still occurs at are basically 1, 2, 3 sites basically now that species is found at. So it's not doing particularly well. And that's down to things like this signage here at Camber, where it used to be one of its strongholds, where it's sort of no dogs, no horses. So even if the beetle was still extant on site, there isn't actually any dung for it to eat, because during its breeding season, which is July, August, September, the local council basically banned the only supply of dung that there would have been there, which is horses and dogs. So I don't think that one's going to do so well there. This is another one that disappeared. And from the review, this is one of the ones that shocked me quite heavily, because when we started looking at the data, this species had a massive crash in the sort of 90s. I mean, incredible crash. I mean, I used to see it in the Brecklands quite often, and in some numbers at some points. And then I kind of, doing the review, my colleague Steve Lane sort of like phoned me up and just said, well, Nutricornis is coming out as a real rarity. And I was like, oh no, it's common in the Brecklands, it's fine. And we went over to the Brecklands and I didn't find it. And then I went back to the Brecklands and didn't find it. I've now been going back to the Brecklands since 2015. So that's what, 5 years, bar COVID last year. We've looked at, so this is a bit out of date now, this site, this record, but over in the Brecklands, we've looked at over 40 sites. We've only found 2 beetles at one site. That's it. We've been to every known locality for this beetle. And the only place it is doing particularly well at the moment is actually in South Wales. And that's because the conservationists and Natural Resource Wales actually have permanent grazing on the sand dunes and on the loose dunes, which is what this beetle needs. So as you saw from here, there was one record from up in North Wales, and so, but only one individual. And we surveyed for that a few years ago. And it was recorded between 1996 and 2017. So those are the known locations of the actual specimens. We did a live trapping. So this is where you put dung-baited pitfall traps, but you don't kill the beetles. You basically put sand in the bottom so the beetles fall in and just bury themselves. So we did a survey in 2019. So this is all of the spots that we recorded the beetles. So the site coverage is reasonable. It doesn't like the wet areas, so we didn't do much work there. So we basically recorded 562 beetles of 18 species, but we didn't manage to find Nutricornis, despite checking a lot of dung and actually trapping for it. And we're not even sure why this is. It could be because of chemical treatment of the cattle. It could be that the cattle were taken off the 4 dunes during the peak breeding season for the beetle, because they don't breed in the slacks. They don't like the wet soil in the slacks of the dunes. So that could be the reason for that, but we just don't know. This is a really nice beetle. It's quite little. That's my thumb, and that's the beetle. So it's quite a little thing. And this species is one that has always been considered rare in the UK, with Kent being its stronghold. And in fact, this is literally the main place that every specimen you'll see in a museum collection comes from. So this is near Lyddon in Kent. And it's a national nature reserve. It's a beautiful bit of chalk downland, but unfortunately they stopped grazing it because of conserving some orthoptera, I think it was, and some plants. So they basically removed the grazing in the summer when the beetle's active. So it disappeared, it went extinct. And that was, at the time, that was the only locality for this beetle. And luckily we've found it, weirdly, over in the Forest of Dean a few years back. And also in Kent just recently. We rediscovered it at a different site. But this site, we've got improved pasture one side and the NNR the other. I don't know how many hours I've spent looking in the sheep poo here, but I've never found this beetle, and yet to find it in the NNR, but we've spent a lot of time looking. So it's likely gone extinct at that site, which is a bit of a shame really, because it's very pretty. So I mentioned dung quality. Obviously one of the big impacts on dung fauna and flora, it's not just the dung beetles, although I kind of go on a bit probably about dung beetles. It's, you know, other things both in the dung itself, but also in the soil below the dung. A lot of these chemicals that we use to treat worms are pretty awful, to be quite honest, and they have a really negative impact on the dung fauna and flora. And the sad thing is it's not species specific. Sorry, it's not species. All species are equally tolerant. So you'll find one beetle, you need X parts per million, and it will have an impact. Whereas another beetle will be able to survive that. So we're going to end up with basically all of these beetles that are just well-hard for chemical pollution and for pesticides. And all of the interesting ones, which happen to be all of the sort of rarest ones, funnily enough, are really sensitive to these chemicals. So we're going to end up with lots of common beetles in the dung, which don't really do that functioning very well because they're all just dwellers and all little things. So the use of these sort of endecticides, these sort of chemicals, are probably going to have some of the biggest impacts on the dung fauna and flora. And it's not just this sort of immediate death when the beetles basically are in the dung itself. It's also the sublethal effects where they impact both the ability of the beetles to breed, so the fecundity is reduced, the amount of eggs they can produce, their ability to disperse once they have kind of emerged, if they've been in the dung with have the chemicals in it. So it impacts them in loads of different ways. And there is, so this is from Sarah Banyan's research. So she did a PhD a few years back and looked at alternatives. And it kind of, in the UK, unlike in Australia and New Zealand, where they've had the worst case scenario of lack of dung beetles, they actually are more dung beetle friendly with their wormers. And in the UK, it is moving towards that with people using mob grazing and using herb lays that include some natural worming plants like chicory and things like that, and samfoin, and moving the animals around between fields. So you break up the sort of like the supply of dung and the habitat for the worms to produce, and also help the beetles as well. So with the regen farming and nature-friendly farming, we've got, you know, high hopes for an increase in dung beetle, not only diversity, but population levels, if there's a reduction in the use of these chemicals. So Ceri and I have been bashing around with dung beetles for a while. So that's actually a distribution map of where we've been collecting or recording recently. So that's only in, I think it's 2017-18. And we generated about 6,000 records, 74 species, and rediscovered 3 of them. These are things that were thought extinct. And when you actually look at some of our distribution maps, it's pretty much biased towards where we go, because we spend a lot of time focusing on dung beetles, whereas others do a lot of general collecting. And most people don't actually like to stick their hands in poo for some reason. But dung beetles can be found at any time of the year. And we're not just dealing with, you know, going out and sticking our hands in some poo. So this is flood debris, which is a good source of records for dung beetles. Badger poo is always good. You can find some dung beetles not only breeding in the badger poo, in particular Onthophagus cenobita really likes badger poo, but also, as you can see in there, hopefully some blues sticking out. So that's actually Geotrupes. So the badgers are better at finding door beetles than we are usually. So if you actually find badger latrines or badger poo with door beetles in, you can identify some of the fragments to species level. And then there's the winter active species, which tend to be the least recorded because nobody wants to go out in winter and stick their hands in cold poo, let alone warm poo in the summer. So we kind of go out at all times of year and sort of like and try all different methodologies to collect. And even on our honeymoon, we kind of managed to get a bit of dung beetling action in. So there's Ceri in her dress and me and my Sue looking in alpaca dung, because obviously on your wedding day, you've got to make it special. So it couldn't just be horse or cow dung. And we actually did quite well because we found a lot of records for this thing, which was one of our target species for our honeymoon in South Devon. So that's the before, 1 record for South Devon, and the after, we generated quite a few new records for that 1 beetle. So definitely a good and worthy honeymoon. I can recommend it. Again, when you look at record density and coverage, we've got reasonable coverage for our data. But when you look at the sort of all records, you can pretty much see where we live. And that's Warwickshire, which is where I grew up. Over there's the Brecks, where I've been looking for that 1 beetle numerous times. We had a PhD student up this way many, many years ago. The New Forest, there's a rarity there that I've been looking for 30 years, and we found it about 3 years ago for the first time. So this is kind of recorder effort, and it kind of shows on this as well. So that's SP37 probably. That's where my house was when I was a kid. That's the Brecks, that's the New Forest, and that's where we live now. So unfortunately, a lot of the records are kind of very much a recorder bias. But we do get out and try and train others. So this is us with the Teniptra Trust in Cheshire a few years back, and it was persistently raining. It was a pretty awful day. We did record about, I think, 8 species or something like that. So, I mean, it was worth doing. And hopefully some of these people, you probably don't recognise anybody apart from Gary in the middle there. are going out and recording beetles, which is what we want people to do. So identification, there's lots of useful ID guides out there, and Andrew Duff's new book's just come out. It is expensive, but it's definitely worth the money because it covers a lot of other groups, not just the dung beetles, but it's the most up-to-date and the best illustrated of all the keys. But you can get the free downloads of these two books up here, so Fauna de France, Burrow, which is a really good book. It's in foreign, but you know, you can learn to read that quite easily. And then this is a really nice illustrated key as well. So you can get these as free downloads as well. So there's plenty of literature out there for identification. There's not just the dung beetles, as I mentioned earlier in the dung, there's a whole suite of things. So we've got the hydrophilids, the rove beetles and the clown beetles. And so we get a lot of records for things like the hysterids and hydrophilids where people are a bit confused that they send us pictures, is this a dung beetle? And it's all to do really with antennae, I guess. If you look at the antennae of most of these, they're filiform, so they're just long and thread-like, or they're clubbed, but it's a symmetrical club. Whereas in the dung beetles, they always have an asymmetrical club, which makes them quite easy to identify at family level. All of the scarabs have this sort of like asymmetrical club. And even for these groups in the dung, there are really good books to identify. So the water beetles that occur in dung, there's a key for those. The rove beetles, pretty much all of them apart from the aleocorines, which will come out in Andrew's next book, are covered by Royal Enstock keys. And this is literally just hot off the press. I think it's out like this week or last week. The hysterid clown beetles, it includes the sylphids as well. So Ashley Whiffin's sylphids and Steve Lane's hysterids are all covered with amazing keys and distribution maps and all sorts of stuff. So now you can actually identify a large proportion of the beetles you find in poo, which is quite handy. And then we've got the Insects of the Cow Dung Community by Peter Skidmore, which is kind of a really good starting book and starting place. If you want to just grab a pile of poo and look at it over your kitchen table, this book here will be a very good guide to everything you're going to find from flies to mice to beetles. This is the Duff series of Beetles of the British, Britain and Ireland. Volume 2 will be coming, and that will cover all the rove beetles, including the sort of little aleocorines, which there's a heap of them in dung. And then obviously volume 3 is the one that just covers dung beetles. There's also the UK Beetle Recording site, which has got loads of useful information on it. There's our website, which has got some free stuff, including ID guides and stuff like that. There's things like this that we produced years ago to sort of encourage people who are mothers to record the beetles that they get. And primarily it was because I was interested in this thing called Melolontha hippocastani, which is a Scottish thing. And there were old records for England, but we found all the specimens now that those records are based on, and they're all misidentifications. So as far as we know, it's still only found in Scotland, and a few records for Southern Ireland. So we kind of get these guys to try and encourage the sort of non-coleoptera people to record things. We also managed to get to a lot of museum collections to look at the historic data. So that's Steve Lane and Ceri there being entertained. And by going to museums, we get a very good range of historical records, but also we can correct misidentifications. And in fact, this is one of mine. So this is a beetle SP3778. That's sort of where my house, St Bartholomew's Church. I collected that in 1987. And I think, I can't remember when we re-identified it. So I identified that as Aphodius fetens. And I questioned this record of my own because it just seemed a bit dodgy. And actually it turned out to be a misidentification of Rufus. It was just a pale form of Rufus. So I corrected that identification. So I'm not only correcting others, but I'll correct my own misidentifications as well. And by looking in museum collections, we actually discovered this thing new to Britain. So this thing called Punctato sulcatus, which in the old literature was used for another species. So there's all sorts of confusion with the identification and nomenclature, which is all resolved in Duff's book. So just use that one. And we've since found specimens in a lot of collections. I think we're 40 specimens, and we've checked about 5,000. So we're not doing too bad on this beetle. But it was basically extinct before we even knew it was here, according to the the review that we did. but we actually managed to find some specimens in Scotland, which was the first known UK specimens, all from Deal, but they were basically in the Waterhouse collection. Then we went to London and found some there. And then we went to Kent to actually see what the hell was going on down in Kent. So that's the original location for the site. It was mostly Deal Castle. That's pretty much golf course and not a lot going on there anymore. There's certainly no dung apart from dog, occasional human. But in a field just a bit further north, in a sheep field, in the third, I think it was the second or third piece of dung I picked up, we actually found the beetle. So this is a thing that was thought extinct, probably because it wasn't properly recognised as British, but also because it just looks like all the other dung beetles at that time of year. So it's quite a hard one to identify. But in the field, it was really distinctive. It's an absolutely handsome beast. This was a boy, which is now in our museum collection in Oxford, because it's like the voucher. So that was quite nice. So for Cheshire, we've actually been doing quite a bit of work up north in Lancashire, Cheshire, mostly because we've been visiting to look for that rare thing on Ainsdale and doing survey work there, but also because of the museum collection. So we spend quite a lot of time at Liverpool doing data mining and verification. And the sort of like the start, I guess, or the sort of like Ellis is basically the start in the 1880s of proper recording of the beetles for that area. Then you've obviously got the Coleoptera of Lancashire and Cheshire, which is just an amazing publication by Sharp. The one issue that we have is that for some of these things where the nomenclature, so the names have changed or there's confusion with the identifications, without the actual specimens, sometimes you kind of have to ignore some of that data, which is a bit annoying. And so going back to the museum collection in Liverpool and in Manchester and Cardiff and in the Horniman, these are all collections that contain specimens for that area that we need to track down and verify the identifications of. But in terms of number of records for the county, for Cheshire in particular, we've got, it's pretty poorly recorded as far as I can tell. I mean, in iRecord, there's about 200 records, which is pretty good for a county. We hold about 250 records, but then we've got a lot of data backlog from the museum collection in Liverpool, which we're still working on. And then the local records centre has about 500 plus whatever the Schaefers are. It's a problem with getting data out of some databases because of the failure in taxonomy. So I did a bit of a sum up of what was going on in the county, and what we've got here is the sort of the species, the national status, and when they were first recorded and last recorded. So you see there's actually quite a decent number of geotroopids. Vernalis hasn't been recorded for a while, and it's probably still up on any sort of heath and moor type habitat. It tends to be an upland species in the north, but also occurs on dunes. But going on my visit to the sand dunes several years ago on Birkenhead, they're pretty awful now. So there's still some work to do with these species. So there are modern records, but not that many. When we get to the Ophodiines, we've got a few that have disappeared from the area, and these have actually disappeared pretty much from the whole of the sort of northwest, pretty much. So that's Sordida, Distinctus, and Pacoli. This one's a summer species. These two are kind of early spring, winter species. And these are nationally declining as well. So it's not just a northwest thing, but it's primarily down to, in the northwest, down to the reduction in grazing on the sand dune systems and on suitable habitat, which is a bit of a shame, really. So here's a sort of a map. This is one of the most abundant species in the UK. This is Rufopes, that thing that's the bat food, and it's everywhere. But I mean, for us, we've got so few records for it in our database. And I think the same applies for the local record centre and even iRecord. And that's down to mostly that people just don't submit records or don't record it. But this is the one where I think the moth trappers provide most data for, because it comes to light traps. So in theory, it should be in every single one of those 5 kms that are shown there. But we're still waiting for data, or, you know, we haven't put out a call, so it's not anybody's fault, really. It just shows that the lack of data for a species is quite prevalent. Oops. Here we've got a few more species, 2 extinct again. So Subterraneous, that's nationally extinct, we're pretty sure of that. And Porcus, We actually surveyed a few years ago in Cheshire for that and just couldn't find it. I mean, it still could be up there, it's just we haven't found it yet. So it's very easy to sort of, you know, find things in terms of if they're quite widespread and abundant where you find them. But if there's only a few individuals at a site, it can be quite hard to find them. So here's fasciatus, which is a northwestern specialist. And that, again, should be more widespread in the county, but it won't ever be, you know, everywhere. It's quite a rarity. So subterraneous used to be common on the sandhills at Wallasey, last recorded in the sort of like, in the sort of late early 1900s. So this has completely disappeared from the whole of the UK, with the last record in about 1951. And there's also sort of conflicts over who recorded it and when. So this is from Sharp's actual archive. So this is in Sharp's hand. And I think he says something like May, and up here we've got June. So I don't know whose record is correct. So was it that one or that one that you consider as correct? So that requires some further work. And again, here we've got Euheptaleucus villosus. I don't think this is going to be extinct in the area because it's just a bugger to find. It doesn't go to dung very often, so you rarely find it in dung. If you pitfall trap a lot, you might find it, but it requires sort of sandy or limestone habitats. It likes light soils. And it's very sporadic. It just randomly occurs at sites. You know, you can go there for several years and not see it, and then one evening you can go around sweeping and you see loads of them. So you kind of find it on an ad hoc basis. The huge cluster of records over in the Brecklands is because of a lot of pitfall trapping on RSPB reserves as part of their sort of surveying technique. So, you know, it does turn up, but it's not that common. Similis, this is one that's disappeared from a lot of areas. This was again only found on the sort of sandy sites in the county. And it just disappeared because of the grazing, the cessation in grazing basically. But it is quite widespread and quite abundant. And a few years ago, we rediscovered it up in Scotland. So, I mean, it's not a northern restriction thing. It, you know, it does get further north than Chestershire, Lancashire. It just hasn't been recorded there for a while, possibly because of reduction in grazing and habitat loss for it. So copris, this is a bit of an enigma because there's two records for the sort of that sort of area up in the sort of northwest, neither of which we've managed to track down the specimen. I mean, it's almost impossible to misidentify. It's huge and it's got a big horn, but you never know. So there's a Chapel and a Collins record. Now, Joseph Collins was a really good recorder, so it seems unlikely he's made a misidentification. But the source of the data actually comes from somebody else publishing his record. So we need to track down the original specimen, which is in Horniman Museum. So that's, you know, once we get rid of all this COVID rubbish, we can actually go and visit there and extract the data or check the specimen. And Chapel's specimen, in theory, a lot of Chapel's collection went to Edinburgh, and we haven't actually found that beetle in the Edinburgh collection. So again, this is another sort of, is it real or is it, you know, Chapel said, oh, I caught a beetle when he was down the pub with his mates. And it's become sort of a record instead of just hearsay. So again, these two need following up. To me, I mean, it's extinct nationally. So, I mean, it seems unlikely that it's still going to occur in the county. But it'd be nice just to verify whether or not this went locally extinct or whether it was misidentifications. So these are the sort of non-dung feeding dung beetles, if you like. So the chafers and the sort of stem dwellers, these things down the bottom here. And again, we've got a few that have gone locally extinct. One like Oxythyrea, which is now an established introduction. In the 50s, when this was recorded, it was basically probably just a random one brought over in some plants or something. But most of the other things are kind of doing okay. Dorcas, I was quite surprised at how few records there were for the area. I mean, it is more abundant in the south than in the north, and it doesn't get as far north as Scotland. But I was surprised at the lack of records. And I think, again, it might just be down to under-recording and it's probably restricted to nice quality woodland habitats. But Fabulosus, there's one record from Woodhead, out of Wool, reported by Johnson in 1962. This is a sandy soil and limestone grasslands thing. So again, we need to track down the specimen to check the identification of this. I mean, it seems possible because there are records from in Scotland, for example, but you know, again, it's this sort of hearsay sort of record, and we need to confirm it with an identification of the actual voucher. And then Rhizothorax rufus, which has been a bane in my life for 25 years. I've been going up to the Sefton coast to look for this thing, and have failed to find it every time I've been. And yet, and we got given some funding from the Tiniptra Trust, Gary Hedges, to actually go and look for it. You saw the results of some of that earlier for brevis, and we failed to find it. But we did find some very potentially good habitat for it. And then Gary Hedges actually managed to find it last year, which I was very, very jealous about. So I still haven't seen that one in the UK. So that's one for next year if I don't get to it this year. And the sad thing is that the Wallasey Sandhills in Cheshire were pretty much one of the go-to places for beetles and for beetlers at one point. And they basically just got destroyed by human intervention, golf courses, and all the other things that we do to sand dune systems. I mean, this is from Ellis in the 1880s. So of the 39 aphodius recognised as British, he's taken 22 just at one site. I mean, that's amazing and incredible for that area. We visited there in 2017 and we caught 2 beetles, one of which is a sand dune specialist. That's any bit of sand dune with a bit of marrum, it will be there. And the other one is this tiny little beetle, which was actually new to Cheshire at the time, but it's actually from California, so it doesn't really count as a nice beetle to find. It's just a species that's an established introduction, was introduced into the Lancashire sand dunes, probably in ship ballast, and is just spreading because it can survive on the worst bits of sand dunes. So I think this needs to be taken off the list for the county. It's not a typical site for it. I mean, sand dune systems, yes, but northwest, probably not. And it was recorded by Hardy, and Hardy's data is a bit dodgy at best sometimes. So it's likely that this was a camber or a deal specimen that got mixed up by labelling. So it's a mislabeled specimen, if it does exist even. We haven't managed to find the specimen. And the other one is Nutricornis, and there's a record for Delamere Forest, and that's just down to a misinterpretation of the name. So any data pre-1950s pretty much of Nutricornis needs checking, because 99% of them just turn out to be Similis because of the literature and the issues with identification back then. So that's one that can go. And Quadrimaculatus is one that again was recorded by Hardy, and again Johnson sort of like doubts the veracity of his record. So it could be just that it was actually this thing down here, which is called Hemorrhoidalis because it's got a red bum. And when you get very pale specimens and very well marked ones, it has 2 red spots at the bottom and 2 red spots at the top, exactly the same as this thing. I mean, it does look completely different, but if you kind of just take a glance at it, or you are quite awful at identification, they do look very, very similar. And in fact, most of the misidentifications we get given or get to see of this beetle are in fact Hemorrhoidalis. So sort of data's sort of a bit skewed for my group, mostly because everybody records the big and impressive. So if you look at the MBN, for example, almost, well, over half the data is just for stag beetle. I mean, that's down to the People's Trust because they did an amazing job at recording stag beetle and getting lots of data in. But it means that, you know, for a lot of the species, we don't actually have the data to assess the conservation values of these things or where they are. iRecord is now changing that, thankfully. So we're now getting a lot more data and data movement through iRecord. So at the moment, we've got about 17,000 records of 89 species and 4,000 recorders. I mean, that's a huge amount of information that's been generated just in the last sort of decade. I mean, some people are putting all their historical records on it, and anybody can pick this stuff up because it's publicly accessible. And you see one of your local recorders is actually in the trending recorders for the whole group, which is pretty impressive. I think Sam's about as well, actually. So Again, though, we've got this sort of very much a bias towards the beetles that either rufopes, it comes to light trap, melolontha comes to light trap, stag beetle, it's big and impressive. So again, we've got this very much a bias towards the big, impressive, easily recording. We do start to see some of the smaller aphodius coming in further down. But I have to say, on iRecord, we have actually, had some amazing records. And even data for the common things is really, really useful. We do find misidentifications that are kind of a bit ridiculous sometimes. So this is the record that was submitted as Norimus, and I think most of you would recognise that as a cockchafer, that green metallic thing being Norimus. So there are misidentifications, but for me, it's not. I'm just thankful this person took the effort just to record this. So what we do is we'll get back in touch with them, offer them some ID tips and ID help and links to websites or ID resources, because the fact that they bothered to submit a record is the most important thing. The fact they made an error is irrelevant, really. They've provided an image that we can actually identify the beetle from. So, I'm quite happy with that. The problem then becomes is when we start getting a lot of data that's unvalidated for very rare things. So this is Fracticornis, which you'll remember from earlier. It only occurs really in the Mendips. If we look at the Embian Atlas for this thing, it's quite widespread. It occurs all the way over in the Brecklands by the looks of it, all over South Wales and randomly elsewhere. This data has then been translated to GBIF, which is an international thing. You see our distribution for this species is quite widespread. So, you'd think that doesn't have a conservation value. When you actually drill down into the records and the data, that's basically the known distribution at the present. So it's only known from the Mendips, and only about 10 sites really. The northern records, there's only one individual there, and there's been no record since, and we've been to look and we can't find them. We've been down to Cornwall, we can't find it there. Again, it's one individual. There's several individuals found just north of Cardiff on some nice limestone grassland, which no longer exists. So it's not there anymore, probably. So it's literally just the Mendips. So if we use the MBN to assess its conservation status, it probably wouldn't really, come much than sort of, I don't know, nationally scarce or something. But it's actually vulnerable. And this thing is critically endangered. It's only known from one area, the Mendips, and it's really reliant on continual grazing and permanent pasture. So we only need to take the animals off for one season, or have a massive worm problem where they just treat all the livestock. It'll have a huge impact on this species. And then you find issues with nomenclature. And this is something I kind of commented on earlier, where basically what we've got is the same names for different things used in different times. So this is a distribution map for one species that actually most of the records probably don't refer to the actual species it's meant to be showing. And this isn't the fault of anybody. It's just if you don't know the literature and you don't understand that putridus has been used 3 different times for 3 different species, you wouldn't actually pick up on this. So next for us, I suppose, we've got some holidays planned in all of the under-recorded areas. We're going to try and rediscover some of the species that are believed extinct. Rufa has now been found by Gary Hedges. We found Brevis, we found Quadrimac, Dasticus vulneratus at one new site. These are the 2 near Bath that we're going to be looking for probably for the next decade or more and never finding, but we'll keep trying. And Subterraneous, which is the one that I've commented on earlier, that's just disappeared from everywhere. So it's about sort of like searching for the rarities at their historically known sites, but also going to areas that are under-recorded, where there's potential for these things. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.